Hi, this is Ken Pletsky with Straight Talk Real Estate, and we are continuing our series on the Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement. We've been doing this series for several weeks now, and it is a great episode if you're thinking about buying houses and you have to now understand the law that you have to be under a Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement with a buyer agent when you're out there. And we've been breaking them down paragraph by paragraph so you completely understand the entirety of what you're signing and make sure that you have all of it explained to you by the agent you're working with and that you have clarity on it. And we're talked a week or so ago about compensation, and this week we're going to continue that a little bit because this is the stuff you may owe in after or before the agreement ends, right? And these are some pieces that sometimes are left out in explanations when agents are trying to explain the agency agreement, or they just turn it to you and have you sign via electronic signature and you didn't read it in its entirety. And that's why I do this series, so that you can completely understand it before you sign it, so that you know what you're signing and you're not caught off guard or surprised if something was to happen. This part about the Buyer Brokerage Service Agreement, where the compensation may still be owed, is what buyers might be the most confused about. And it can impact you when you're under an agreement or even after it ends. So I'm going to try to break it down so you can completely understand when you owe the commission or what might cause you to owe a commission after the agreement is over. So during the agreement, while you're home shopping and you're out looking for homes and you find the perfect house, there's something that can happen here, and it's called a compensation gap. That's between the Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement, where you signed with your buyer agent and you agreed to a compensation. And the gap might be the difference of what the seller is willing to pay the buyer broker for you on your behalf and what you agreed to in the Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement. And that gap could be, 0.5%. It could be a 1%. It just depends on the seller's net, as we discussed earlier in some of our episodes, talking about where the sellers look at the net when they're looking at price, the closing costs you may be asking, and including the compensation piece that you're requesting be paid to your buyer agent on your behalf. Because you signed the agreement, you agreed to pay the buyer broker a certain percentage of the compensation amount of the purchase price. And in that today, a large percent of sellers are still paying that. They may not be paying the full amount, and that's the gap we're talking about. So let's say you sign your agreement with your agent as a buyer agent, and the compensation says 3%. And you find a home that you want to buy, and when the agent investigates the house and calls up the listing agent and asks what the seller is willing to pay for a buyer agent to bring you out there to look at the house if you want to buy it, that's going to be the first question that they are probably investigating for you on your behalf to make sure that we can get that covered. And let's say the seller is going to only offer 2.5%. Well, if your compensation said 3 and the seller's offering 2.5, now here's the gap, right? The difference is 0.5%, and this has to be addressed. Now, there's a few ways that you can address it, and commonly you can cover the difference yourself, right? The 0.5% is way better than the full 3%. So that's a win right there, and that's what our buyers tell us. You can renegotiate with your agent and redo an addendum to the Buyer Agency Services Agreement and make an amendment to the services agreement that says, hey, we had signed for 3, but they're only offering 2.5%. So therefore, would you agree on changing it? The agent does not have to do that. I'm not saying they won't, but that would be one method of addressing the gap, right? The other method would be you could structure your offer differently. You might increase the price of the purchase or take out a little bit of less of your closing costs if you negotiated that in and cover that 0.5% that way. That's 3 ways that you can address the gap. Like I said before, a lot of our buyers are just ecstatic. We got the seller to cover, 90%, 95% of that. So that's important to understand. Just because the seller's offering compensation, it just doesn't mean it's what you agreed to when you signed your buyer agency agreement. And a lot of buyers don't even realize that even when they're writing their offer. And so there's a line 17 in the purchase and sale agreement where this is addressed, and there's a space for what the seller is offering. And then the agent can write in what they're requesting. And that's typically going to be what's written on your buyer agency agreement. And it may be higher than what the seller is offering. If the seller was offering higher than that amount, then there's a clause in there that says that extra money would actually go toward your closing costs. And that may be a win as well. But we don't see sellers really offering too much higher than some of the common fees that you've historically been in the past. So, but this is when it becomes a real decision on how you structure your offer. Because like I mentioned, the seller is looking for the net when they look at it. They're going to take their purchase price offer, the accepted price. They're going to look at any of the terms, and they're going to look at the closing costs maybe you've requested. And they're also going to be looking at this buyer agent commission that you have requested be paid by the seller. Those are all things that are going to affect that net. And therefore, you may have to be structuring your offers differently or working out a strategy to make sure that that gets paid unless you're willing to cover the gap. Another part of the buyer agency agreement is called a protection period. And this is the period for after the agreement with the buyer agent ends and you didn't buy a house from them during the agreement phase, but it's expired now. And we talked about that, I think, when we talked about timing in terms of, I think it was paragraph 2 of the buyer agency agreement. It talks about how long that agreement will go for. But let's say that you have now looked through houses with this buyer agent for quite some time and you just didn't make any offers. It didn't, nothing came to fruition on anything that you looked at that you wanted, and that's expired. And now it's expired. And then there's this, opportunity. You're out driving around, you see an open house, and it happens to be one of the houses that your buyer agent had shown you. And if the buyer agent had shown you the house, introduced you to the property, spent time helping you investigate it and talk about it, and you buy that house directly from the listing agent there, you may be obligated to pay a buyer services agreement that you agreed to in your contract, because there's a protection period in there that you need to fill out on the number of days of how long that would last. Sometimes it's 180 days, 120 days. You can negotiate it to 30 days. That it only applies for that period of time, because there is a possibility that you might go back after a few weeks or after a month to a home an agent had showed you. And if they showed you that house, and even if you're working with another buyer agent and or the listing agent, that property was already introduced to you. So the agent may have some compensation obligation from you to cover that. So your original agent may still be entitled to that. You need to know when that expiration is, and you need to know when the protection clause ends so that you are covered before you get yourself into a situation where maybe some agent's pursuing you for compensation even though they didn't write the offer. So over the years, I spent times with buyers getting surprised by certain situations. This is all pretty recent because of the new 2 years ago when we started the buyer agencies and the compensations being agreed to in that form. But before that, we called it a loyalty agreement, and we just wanted the buyer's loyalty as a buyer representative and working with them that make sure they weren't just using every other agent out there on the market. And that goes back to the exclusivity or non-exclusivity, right? We wanted that loyalty, and agents really work hard to get that and work hard for you when you are their exclusive loyal client. But this is where it gets a little bit confusing, because after the close, you go out and find a house after your term is up, but you didn't pay attention to everything in your agency agreement. You could get an invoice in the mail saying that you owe a compensation. So, here's where buyers get caught off guard in times that we talk with them about it and we hear stories about it. And it's just not understanding the compensation gap. We actually do a really good job of explaining it when we sign our buyer's agency agreement that the seller may not pay this full amount. So are you comfortable with paying the balance, right? That's a gap. If they pay the full amount or pay over our full amount, you're covered, and even better, you may have some compensation coming towards your closing costs that can apply if the lender allows it. Another one is always assuming that the seller is covering everything. I mean, it's a common mistake. We're even hearing lenders tell buyers today, and I just wish they would stop, that sellers are always paying closing costs. So the reality is it's always a negotiation. The seller's looking at that net, right? They're looking at what you offered on price. They're looking at what you asked for in the terms. They're looking for what you asked for in the repairs. They're looking for what you asked for in closing costs. They're also looking for what you're asking for the seller to pay in your buyer compensation line. So, and not reading and understanding that protection clause is another one that gets people caught off guard when they go back to houses without realizing, the connection of a house that was shown to them a month ago and buying that house and then getting surprised by an agent requesting compensation for that. So these are all important pieces. This is why I'm explaining the contract as thoroughly as I am, because I want you to understand it and make sure that you're not caught off guard, you're not surprised, and you understand how to write winnable offers and buy that dream home that you're searching for. So just to wrap it up, compensation is agreed to up front, and it's negotiable, but it's negotiable when you sign. It can also be renegotiated if the seller does not agree to pay the full compensation, but it's not mandatory that the agent agree to that. And it can be paid in a variety of ways, right? You can increase the price to cover the compensation. If you didn't have it, you can pay it direct. You can maybe knock off some closing costs you asked for if you were and the seller had agreed to it. But there are some pieces there you need to pay attention to. The other one is, of course, even after the agreement ends, there still may be obligations tied to that. So you make sure that you watch that clause and watch the days of time that you have before you would be released of any obligation of compensation. So it's all about understanding this agreement so there's no surprises, and that's why we do this. We try to keep you educated on what's going on, the new laws. Pretty soon we're going to be going under all the new laws under the listing sides of things too for you sellers out there. So if you understand this before you start, you're going to avoid confusion and make better decisions throughout this entire process, and make sure that you're not misunderstanding the entire brokerage agreement and get caught off guard. So if you found this helpful, and make sure you subscribe, as I said before, so you don't miss out on our next episode, and definitely go back if you're in the buying process or you know someone who is, share the series so that they're educated on what it takes when they are home shopping, and that they are required to be in a buyer brokerage services agreement, and what that looks like in its entirety, fully explained right here on this channel. So this is Ken Paletsky with Straight Talk Real Estate. And if you're thinking about buying and you want to walk through this before you start, reach out to me. I'm always happy to help. All right. We'll see you on the next one.